Welcome back. Today we're diving into a highly specific, really analytical journey through some foundational scriptural text.
That's right.
Our sources are really zeroed in on one single event. The precise nature, the true extent, and ultimately the duration of the curse. The one laid upon the earth after Adam's transgression back in Genesis chapter 3.
And this is, well, it's a high-stakes deep dive because we aren't just listing consequences here. We're actually trying to map the precise boundaries of corruption.
Right.
The sources our listener shared, they force us to ask some really fundamental questions like, where does the curse even begin? Does it touch every physical part of existence? And if it does, how does that change what we should expect for future prophetic events? I'm thinking specifically about the 1,000-year kingdom.
Yeah, what's fascinating, I think, is just the sheer complexity you find when you dig in.
It's layered.
It really is. Our sources give us not just one narrative, but, well, several, deeply researched and often conflicting interpretations about what exactly was cursed. So that means we have to grapple with these really nuanced definitions of corruption, death, vitality, and it's all based purely on how different interpreters read just a few verses in Genesis 3.
Yeah.
This isn't surface-level stuff. It's like theological map-making, cartography.
That's a great way to put it. And that cartography, it has to start with a clear distinction. We absolutely have to separate what might have been an inevitable consequence of creation.
Okay.
The simple fact that Adam was made from dust, from what was an imposed punishment, the curse itself.
The inherent versus the imposed.
Precisely. And whether you make that separation or how you make it, that determines, well, pretty much the entire scope of human history and ultimately redemption.
Okay, so let's unpack this then.
Okay.
Starting right at the trigger point.
Yeah.
Adam's disobedience.
Yes.
His act. Listening to his wife, eating the forbidden fruit. It just unleashed this immediate, divinely pronounced cascade of consequences.
Instantly.
And our sources, they really distill this down. A triple consequence right there in Genesis 3, verses 17 through 19.
That's the core text. The first consequence is the cursing of the land, the ground itself.
Okay.
God explicitly states, because Adam chose to ignore the command, the land would become, well, hostile. It would yield frustrating results. It demands continuous, lifelong toil, sweat, just for Adam to produce food.
So hardship imposed directly on labor.
Exactly. The very act of sustaining life becomes a struggle.
Which flows right into the second consequence, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The environmental manifestation of that frustration.
Yes. The curse isn't just an abstract idea. It becomes tangible. Physical.
Right.
The land will bring forth thorns and thistles. And our sources, they emphasize this, looking at the original languages. Thorns and thistles.
These aren't just, annoying weeds in your garden. They're physical symbols.
Yeah.
Systemic symbols of opposition.
Opposition.
They represent the permanent, frustrating effort that's now required to manage an environment that's actively, fighting against human stewardship.
Wow. So the natural world stops being this perfect cooperative partner. It becomes a rival. That's the shift. The thorns and thistles, they signify that the default state of the environment now is one of, let's say, degradation and difficulty. A really stark contrast to the effortless vitality of the garden.
Okay, that makes sense. And the third consequence hits even closer to home, right? Adam's physical destination.
Yes. The return to dust. Genesis 3.19 links death directly back to his material origin.
You are dust.
And to dust you shall return. That pronouncement, it marks the finality of physical life, and it ties the fate of the human body directly to the fate of the cursed land it was taken from.
But the sources are clear. This isn't just external, is it? Affecting the soil and the plants, it goes deeper.
Much deeper. It's profoundly internal. The cursed state of the physical body itself, what the sources term ea, the cursed flesh.
Right.
This state gives rise to inherent bodily desires, or you could say lusts of the flesh. The term used is is.
Juchewi soyok. So the lusts of the flesh.
Yes. And this is the internal manifestation of the fall. It's like a mechanism for sin that's now built into our physical architecture.
So the body, because it's made of this cursed dust, now inherently produces desires that run counter to God's will, a constant internal struggle.
That's the idea.
But wait, if these desires arise from all beings made of earth or dust, does that imply this kind of internal corruption is just unavoidable as long as we're in this material, dust-based form?
That is precisely the implication that gets analyzed. This internal corruption, the Yichirae, it becomes the theological engine that Satan exploits. And this brings us right to that profound shift in authority. Adam didn't just gain a sinful nature, he lost his function, his governing role.
He lost what was the term? The temporary delegated dominion stewardship.
Yes, the akleona, that authority God had given him over creation, gone.
He wasn't just losing, like, management duties. He lost the constitutional mandate, the right to govern creation. So what replaced it?
Well, when Adam sinned, the sources say the reign of command, the ane, where humanity was meant to rule justly by God's word, it ended instantly.
And in its place?
In its place began the reign of violence oppression, ito.
Violence and oppression.
This is how the sources explain the systematic breakdown you see in nature. We shift into the dynamic of survival of the fittest,
Yeah, Yangtze.
where strong creatures prey on the weak. Violence and, importantly, necessary death entered the food chain, the ecosystem itself. It confirms the entire system of creation was corrupted when Adam failed to hold onto his authority.
So the world didn't just become inconvenient or difficult. It became actively, systemically violent, immediately reflecting the spiritual violence of Adam's own rebellion.
You've got it.
The physical world turned predatory because its rightful steward basically abdicated his rule.
Exactly. The source material really emphasizes that this transition is instantaneous. It's profound. It wasn't just Adam having to work harder for his food. The entire framework of nature shifted. Predation, suffering, hostility, they became the new rule, replacing divine order and command.
Okay, so Adam loses authority, creation turns violent. Now we have to bring in the entity who immediately benefited from this whole cosmic shift, Satan.
Right.
Our sources note that Satan is also cursed in Genesis 3:14. He's cursed to eat dust, or earth aiania. Now that sounds humiliating, maybe, but what's the deeper theological significance of being tied to the dust?
It's a crucial link. This curse connects Satan metaphysically to the material realm and critically to the dust body of Adam and all his descendants.
The dust body.
By being cursed to, let's say, consume the earth, Satan establishes a kind of dominion over the land and over the flesh that comes from that land. His sphere of influence gets cemented in the physical, corrupted world.
So, the curse against Satan, it sort of confirms his ultimate defeat, but at the same time, it gives him governance over this sphere of corruption. That seems paradoxical.
It does, but it highlights his role. How does he execute that domination?
Oh.
He exploits the internal flaw we just talked about. Satan utilizes those bodily desires, the uea that arise from the cursed flesh. He uses them to cause people to sin.
So the internal corruption is the engine.
And Satan's the driver, steering those desires towards actual transgression. He doesn't have to invent sin from nothing. He just manipulates the broken mechanism that's already present in the dust body.
Okay, that leads us straight into a really complex nuance, a debate within the sources regarding the environmental curse itself. Who, or what, is the direct cause of the thorns and thistles?
Yes, this is a key point of divergence.
It might seem academic, who made the weeds grow.
Mm-hmm.
But assigning agency here, it dictates how we view God's direct involvement in the degradation of creation after the fall.
It absolutely does. The sources present two distinct views on this. View one holds that God initiates it, but Satan utilizes it.
God initiates, Satan utilizes.
Okay. In this reading, God directly causes the thorns and thistles. It's an act of divine judgment, instantly restructuring the environment. Satan then takes advantage of this newly cursed state of the land to establish his dominion. So it's God's imposed judgment, which the enemy then benefits from and exploits.
Okay. And the other view, view two, how does that differ?
View 2 places the direct agency closer to Satan. It suggests that God curses the land in principle. He declares it will be hostile, but Satan is then given permission, or maybe leeway, to directly generate the thorns and thistles.
So Satan becomes the active producer of the weeds.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
The one sowing the environmental degradation, though ultimately under divine allowance or permission. The implication here is subtle. God maintains a slight distance from actively producing the decay himself, allowing Satan, the usurper, to be the visible agent of that ruin.
Okay, so regardless of who's directly making the thorns grow, the outcome's the same. The environment becomes hostile.
The result is identical, yes.
But the implication of Satan's rule is just undeniable, isn't it? Once Adam became a servant of Sen-Ga, the sources say he automatically became a servant of Satan, who Scripture says holds the power of death.
And there's the connection. If Adam, the delegated ruler, fell under Satan's governance.
Then the whole territory under his rule falls too.
Exactly. The world that was under Adam's temporary delegated rule also fell under Satan's governance. This explains the systemic nature of the oppression and violence we discussed. Adam, essentially, through disobedience, traded away his governing authority to the enemy. He transferred custody of the planet, in a manner of speaking.
So the entire system just flips. Adam's sin cuts him off from God, and the territory entrusted to him, the land, the environment, everything is also cut off from God's immediate perfect governance. It falls under Satan's dominion instead.
Yes. The land begins to literally reflect the nature of its temporary unrighteous governor. It takes on the characteristics of its fallen steward and the dark power now influencing it.
Wow. Okay, this sets the stage perfectly for what you call the analytical core of this deep dive.
Right.
We now have to move from the environmental hostility, the thorns and toil, to the fundamental nature of physical life itself.
Yes. The deepest debate.
We have to ask, was the return to dust, the whole process of aging, physical death, what the sources call yu yang, was that a direct result of the curse? Or was it simply the natural, predetermined fate for any being made of dust, just maybe accelerated or, finalized by the curse?
And this question is absolutely critical, because it determines the scope of redemption itself.
How so?
Well, think about it. If death is just a natural process, part of being material, then resurrection is more like an enhancement of nature, an upgrade. But if death is a curse, a penalty...
then resurrection is a complete reversal of that penalty.
Exactly. It's undoing the punishment. So let's look at the contrasting views on the scope of the curse itself. It really splits the interpretation.
Okay, let's start with view A. This one proposes a narrow scope for the curse.
Right. View A argues that the curse is only the negative aspects imposed on life and labor, the thorns, the toil, and those internal bodily desires, the OA.
So just those three things.
In this view, the body returning to dust, that was always the predetermined outcome for Earth creatures. Death was simply the default state for dust, unless there was perpetual divine upkeep.
So being made of earth, UA, inherently means you're finite.
That's the core argument for view A. They'd suggest that even if Adam had, say, birthed children before he sinned, those children being made of earth would have eventually aged and returned to dust. They might point to Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed for man to die once, as reflecting this inherent reality.
But what about Adam himself then?
Adam himself, in this view, was only protected from this natural decay process by the breath of life, the nous, or neshama. This acted like a kind of spiritual life support system.
Okay.
Once sin caused that neshama to depart or its effect to cease, Adam simply reverted to the natural, predetermined decay rate common to all Earth creatures. The curse didn't cause death, it just removed the temporary shield against it.
Okay, so death was sort of baked into the physical design from the start. The curse just pulled the plug on the life support, letting nature take its course.
That's the essence of view A.
But view B, the broad scope, strongly disagrees.
Vehemently disagrees, yes. View B argues the curse includes the bodily desires and the entire process of aging and decay, the Atma. They see it all as intertwined, one single curse.
Not separate issues.
Not at all. For view B, the return to dust is as much a part of the imposed penalty as the thorns or the toil.
What's their basis for that? It seems like a bigger claim.
They often use Romans 8 as their foundation, specifically Romans 8 verses 20 and 21. Paul writes there that creation, adu, was subjected to futility or corruption.
Only after Adam sinned.
Okay, subjected after sin.
Right. The argument is, if death and decay were already happening naturally before sin, why would Paul say creation was subjected to futility because of sin?
That's a fair point.
For view B, that state of futility means decay, physical decay. Therefore, the decay, the death, the return to dust for all of creation was a direct consequence of the curse. It implies that the pre-fall creation was essentially non-decaying, or at least not subject to the same kind of entropy.
Wow, okay. That distinction whether death is the default state or a direct penalty, it seems to really hinge on understanding the nature of that breath of life, the sakor neshima, that God breathed into Adam.
It absolutely does. That concept dictates whether Adam's physical body was ever meant to live forever in the first place.
So how is neshima interpreted differently? Well, the interpretation of neshama is really the linchpin here. The first view, which often aligns with view B, broad scope of the curse, suggests that neshama was synonymous with the spirit, perhaps even the Holy Spirit, the ruach.
The breath of life was the spirit.
In this interpretation, yes. Its presence acted like a spiritual firewall, preventing the physical dust body from aging or decomposing. Sin caused the spirit to withdraw, or its protective effect to cease, and as a result, the dust body immediately started breaking down.
So the removal of the spirit is the curse that leads to death.
That's the argument. The decay begins when the spirit's protection leaves.
There's a contrasting view on neshama.
Yes. The second view, often aligning with view A, narrow scope, argues that neshama is simply living breath. It's the biological factor that makes Adam a living being, an animated creature, but it is not the same as the spirit, the ruach.
So just breath, not divine presence.
Essentially, yes. If neshama isn't the spirit, then it wasn't the factor preventing death. Death, in this view, was preordained for all dust bodies, regardless of sin, perhaps citing that Hebrews passage again. This view contends that linking neshama directly to the Holy Spirit overcomplicates the Genesis narrative and might contradict the idea that death is just the universal fate of matter.
I have to push back a little on that second view, the one where death is natural.
Okay.
If aging and decay were just the default state of matter even before the fall, why was Adam's primary punishment, the one stated so clearly, tied to his return to dust? Why didn't God just say something like, okay, now that you've sinned, you'll feel the pain of that eventual return sooner, or the path back to dust will be harder?
That's a powerful challenge.
Tying death itself, the return to dust, directly to the curse seems to suggest it was a punitive action, not just letting a natural process play out.
It's a very strong point. Proponents of view A, death is natural, would likely counter that the punishment wasn't death itself, but the manner of life preceding that death. The labor, the sorrow, the difficulty in gaining a livelihood before that inevitable end.
So the curse is the struggle, the toil, the thorns, the suffering during life, rather than the end point of life itself.
For them, yes, the end point, the return to dust, was always fixed simply by being made of dust. The curse just made the journey there miserable.
Okay, that clarifies their position. Let's bring in some linguistic evidence here. What about the idea of corruption? The Greek term phathora, which means ruin, decay, destruction. It shows up in Romans 8.21, talking about freedom from the bondage of corruption. What does this freedom actually refer to?
Well, as you might expect by now, the sources offer two distinct readings of phathora in that Romans 8 context.
Of course.
The narrow interpretation argues that phathora here refers exclusively to the internal corruption we talked about, the rising of bodily lusts and desires, the uko.
So freedom from corruption means freedom from sinful desires.
Primarily, yes. They'd argue the victory over corruption Paul speaks of is mainly an ethical and moral one. It's the spirit winning the internal war against the lusts of the flesh. In this reading, liberation means the soul is no longer compelled to serve those base desires, regardless of whether the physical body still ages and eventually dies.
Okay, so it's about moral freedom, not physical immortality.
Correct, for the narrow view.
But if we adopt view B, the broad scope view, where death is part of the curse,
then phathora has to mean more. It must encompass both the internal lusts and the physical process of decay, the aging, the decomposition, the return to dust.
it has to be both internal and external corruption.
Exactly. If creation itself was subjected to this widespread decay after the fall, as view B holds based on Romans 8, then the liberation of creation that Paul anticipates must include freedom from physical decomposition for all creatures, a true cessation of entropy, at least in the redeemed state.
This is really the ultimate theological crossroads then, isn't it?
It really is.
If death is part of the curse, the millennium, that future kingdom, must logically end it, at least temporarily.
Right.
But if death is just the natural state of dust, then the millennium might prolong life significantly, but it won't stop aging altogether.
Precisely. The argument boils down to whether the physical world is fundamentally redeemable from decay itself, or whether decay is just an inherent property of being a material creation. And that difference, well, it's cosmic.
It changes everything about how we see our physical existence now and in the future. Okay, so let's put these theories to the test. Let's apply them to that prophetic era, the 1,000-year kingdom, the millennium.
Now we take these competing definitions and see how they play out in the prophetic landscape. The setup is key. Satan is bound for this entire 1,000-year period. The sources point to Zechariah 13.1, suggesting this removes deception and results in a time largely free from crime and active sinning.
Okay, Satan's bound, deception is gone. But what about the people living then?
That's the crucial point. The people who enter and live through this kingdom, the general population, they are still in earth bodies. They have yumha. They are distinct from the resurrected saints, the martyrs who reign with Christ and have transformed spiritual bodies.
So they're still fundamentally human, made of dust.
Yes. Which brings us to the core test. Does the curse thorns, lust, death, however you define it, cease for this millennial population living in their natural bodies.
Let's tackle the internal curse first. Bodily lust, the oazabe, what happens to it during the millennium?
Again, two main views emerge. View 1 argues that lust remains.
Even with Satan bound.
Even with Satan bound. The reasoning is that these people haven't received their final transformation. They still possess what the sources might call soul-like bodies, not glorified spiritual bodies. Therefore, the cursed flesh, the high which is the source of ouvis, still exists.
So lust must still arise internally.
It must still arise, according to view 1. This view is often driven by a pragmatic look towards the end of the millennium.
What happens then?
Well, we know Satan is briefly released after the 1,000 years, and he manages to deceive a vast number of people, the Gog and Magog rebellion.
Right.
So, view 1 proponents ask, if lust were completely gone, if that internal mechanism for sin was deactivated, how could Satan possibly succeed in tempting them? The capacity for internal sin stemming from the flesh must still be there.
So for view 1, the peace and lack of sin during the millennium isn't because the desire is gone, but because the primary tempter and deceiver is gone.
Exactly. The absence of sin is due to the removal of Satan's deception and external influence, not the removal of the inherent potential for sin arising from the flesh.
Okay, what's the opposing perspective? View 2.
View 2 argues that lust ends during the millennium.
Completely gone.
Yes. They draw an analogy back to Adam before the fall. Adam had a soul-like body, but the sources agree he had no sinful lust, no io before he sinned. Therefore, view 2 argues the millennial citizens living under the direct rule of Christ when the curse is lifted or suppressed will have their soul-like bodies restored to that pre-fall state. They'll have bodies without the active mechanism of lust.
But then how do they explain the Gog and Magog rebellion? If there's no lust, how are they tempted?
This requires a very specific understanding. For view 2, the curse which they define as including lust and decay is lifted during the millennium. However, the inherent free will and the basic capacity for moral failure remains. Think about Adam again. His original sin wasn't driven by lust. It was an act of direct disobedience.
Ah, so they can still choose wrongly, even without the internal pull of lust.
Precisely. They are still susceptible to temptation when Satan is released, just as Adam was susceptible in the garden. But their bodies are considered internally pure, free from omes, during the 1,000 years itself.
Wow, that difference is subtle but really vital. View 1 says the body is still corrupt, but the external tempter is removed. View 2 says the bodily corruption, the lust part, is removed. But free will still allows for rebellion later.
It's a crucial distinction in understanding human nature during that era.
Okay, now let's apply this to the physical curse. Aging and death. The return to dust. What happens during the millennium?
This is where the debate gets perhaps even more dramatic. View 1 strongly maintains that death remains.
Death still happens in the millennium.
Yes, according to view 1. Remember, this view generally aligns with the idea that aging and death are not part of the curse, but are the natural process for dust bodies.
So if death is natural, not punitive, removing the curse doesn't remove death.
Correct. Therefore, the millennial citizens, being ruo, must still age. The sources might say, oh, okofa, grow old and frail, and eventually they will die.
But surely life is different then.
Oh, absolutely. Their lifespans are expected to be drastically prolonged, perhaps nearing 1,000 years, similar to the lifespans recorded before the flood, but death still marks the end.
Does view 1 have specific scriptural support for death continuing in the millennium?
They argue it's quite robust, yes, and it's important for listeners grappling with this to know these texts. They point to Zechariah 8.4, which describes the restored Jerusalem during that era, mentioning old men and women sitting in the streets with staffs.
Of staff.
Yeah.
Implying age, maybe weakness.
That's the interpretation. A staff usually implies needing support due to physical frailty or advanced age. Furthermore, Isaiah 65.20 is even more explicit. It says, he who dies at 100 will be thought a mere child.
Dies at 100, considered a child.
It clearly confirms death still occurs, albeit rarely perhaps, and at what would be considered a very great age by our standards. The argument is, if the curse being lifted meant death ended completely for those people, those verses wouldn't make any sense.
Right, you wouldn't talk about dying at 100 if no one died.
Exactly. So for view 1, the millennium reverses many effects of the curse, the extreme toil, the thorns dominating, the constant external temptation from Satan, but it doesn't reverse the fundamental nature of the material body, which includes eventual death.
Okay, that seems textually grounded. But what about view 2? How do they argue that death ends?
Well, view 2 starts from their premise. They hold the broad Stoke position, view B from section 3, meaning aging and death are part of the curse.
Oh, okay. So if the curse is lifted?
Then death must be lifted too. If the curse is fully dealt with during the millennium, then the earth bodies of the citizens will no longer age, decay, or return to dust. They achieve a kind of temporary physical immortality for that 1,000-year period.
But what do they do with those Isaiah and Zechariah verses? Those seem like major textual obstacles to the idea of no death.
They have to reinterpret them, naturally. Regarding the staff in Zechariah 8.4, they might argue it's symbolic. The old people are old in age, meaning full of honor, wisdom, authority perhaps, and the staff is purely a symbol of that status or maybe governance, not a literal walking stick needed because their bodies are decaying.
A symbolic staff.
Okay.
In Isaiah 65.2. Dying at 100.
They often interpret that verse differently, too. Perhaps as a statement about life expectancy standards, suggesting that anyone who did somehow die young, maybe through accident or extremely rare judgment, would be seen as tragically cut short, unlike our current perspective. Or they might see it as hyperbole emphasizing longevity. Crucially, proponents of view 2 often believe that texts like Revelation 21.4-5, which mentions no more death or mourning or crying or pain, can be applied, at least in principle, to the millennial world, symbolizing the complete reversal of the Genesis 3.19 death sentence during that time.
Applying Revelation 21 to the millennium, not just the final eternal state, that's a significant interpretive choice.
It is. It requires seeing the millennium as a fuller restoration than view 1 allows.
Let's dig just a bit deeper on the physical side. If view 1 is correct, and death is natural and continues, then these millennial citizens must experience senescence, the biological process of getting old. What do the sources say about maybe the psychological or emotional impact of knowing you're aging, even if it takes 900 years and death is still the inevitable outcome? Is it still dreaded?
That's a fascinating question. The sources leaning towards view 1 often suggest that because Satan is bound and overt sin is suppressed, the fear and the sorrow usually associated with death are largely removed. Death becomes perhaps more like a natural transition at the end of a very long, very fruitful life, rather than the enemy, the catastrophe that cuts life short in rebellion. The sorrow, that we mentioned in other contexts, is replaced by acceptance, perhaps with the knowledge that the ultimate resurrection awaits those who are faithful. It seems to fundamentally change the texture of mortality, even if mortality itself remains.
So the millennium becomes this perfect, almost controlled laboratory setting.
In a way, yes.
And regardless of whether lust is present internally or whether aging is still happening, the sources seem to force a really powerful conclusion based on what happens right at the very end of the 1,000 years.
Yes, the test of Gog and Magog. It's the final proof. When Satan is released for that brief time, he successfully tempts a massive number described as like the sand of the seashore of the millennial population to rebel against God and his saints.
After 1,000 years of peace and righteous rule.
Exactly. And this proves something profound. It shows that even freedom from Satan's deception, freedom from crime, potentially freedom from physical hardship, and even the removal of bodily lust, if you take view 2, for a millennium, still leaves room for catastrophic moral failure.
Which means the absolute root of disobedience isn't ultimately the corrupted environment or even biological desire itself.
It seems not. It points back to the inherent potential for rebellion within free will, the same potential that existed in Adam's original unfallen state in the garden. Satan didn't necessarily need corruption to cause spiritual corruption then, and apparently he doesn't absolutely need it at the end of the millennium either. He just needs an opportunity to exploit free will's capacity to choose wrongly.
Wow. So the millennial kingdom in the end serves as this ultimate demonstration of human moral autonomy, maybe even its fragility.
That seems to be a key theological lesson drawn from it. Perfect governance, perfect environment, incredibly long life, maybe even freedom from lust. And yet, the choice to rebel remains a stark possibility for those still in the noo, the natural body. The curse might be physical and environmental, but the ultimate point of failure, it seems, is always volitional. It's the choice.
Okay. This deep dive has really profoundly complicated what can sometimes seem like a fairly simple theological narrative about the fall.
It adds layers upon layers.
We've seen that Adam's single sin wasn't just a personal failure. It triggered this cosmic shift, a change from, as you put it, the reign of command to the reign of violence. And that altered the very biology and environment of Earth, seemingly permanently until Christ's return.
And I think the most important takeaway here for you listening is really that distinction we spent so much time on. The difference between inevitable mortality, just being made of dust, versus curse decay, death as a penalty. Because if the return to dust was always the natural default for Earth bodies, as View A suggests, then redemption focuses primarily on spiritual and ethical restoration. And the millennial kingdom, in that view, mainly just prolongs life and removes sinful influences. But if aging and death were entirely part of the imposed curse, as View B argues, then the millennial kingdom must involve a true physical reversal of Genesis 3. It has to grant at least temporary physical immortality, or something very close to it, to its inhabitants.
So mapping the curse like this, it determines whether our present suffering, physical decay, disease, aging is just the expected property of matter, or whether it's a direct punishment that will be fully reversed even before the final eternal state truly begins.
Exactly. The difference gives theological weight to every single ache, every failing cell, every tombstone we encounter. Is it nature or is it penalty?
Which leaves us, as always, with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. This one builds on that final test of the millennium, the Gog and Magog rebellion.
If those citizens living in a world effectively free from deception, crime, major hardship, maybe even lust for 1,000 years, if they still overwhelmingly choose rebellion the moment Satan is released, what does this ultimately say about the human heart, about free will itself? It seems to suggest that the greatest, most fundamental threat to obedience isn't necessarily the external temptation from the devil or the internal pull of bodily desire arising from corruption, but maybe it's that inherent potential for disobedience that existed even in Adam's perfect original state.
The raw capacity to say no to God regardless of conditions.
Perhaps. And if even near-perfect conditions couldn't guarantee obedience, then what does that imply about our own capacity for resistance, for faithfulness today, living as we do in a world still very much riddled with corruption, with lust, and with thorns, both literal and metaphorical?
That's a question that should definitely occupy us all. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.